episode 123. If you want to be strong, learn to be alone.
You're listening to the very best podcast in the world on health, wealth, and happiness. Please remember to leave a review and share with all your friends and family. And here is your host, Lars Hilser.
Probably the best feedback email I ever got was last night when I was asked whether I was going through a depressive phase because I was doing so many episodes on solitude and being alone and focusing on so much negativity and, whether I wasn't capable of executing my own concepts that I try to convey on this show. Speaking of that, welcome to the very best and very happiest and not at all negative podcast in the world, your only source in the universe for personal supremacy through health, wealth, and happiness, people. Happiness. This email didn't catch me off guard, but I was noticing like that. No, I wasn't noticing. Sorry, I have to back up 3 or 4 steps to make what I'm trying to say very clear. We started out with, escaping this social conditioning. That was day before yesterday. Yesterday, I said, that may lead to yourself feeling alone. And that's why this whole barrage of solitude episodes came about. Because being alone in this big fucking world is very difficult for a lot of people. So, yesterday I had a great quote that I found. It was stand up, even if it means standing alone. I found that very valuable to share. And today's episode, if you want to be strong, learn to be alone. Kind of like the same concept, because solitude resulting of, what we mentioned on Monday with this, escaping this societal conditioning is, just inevitably leaves you alone because you are so far ahead of pretty much everyone you are in contact with that it may be very difficult to negotiate for a lot of people. That's why I'm trying to focus and kind of convey lessons on how to deal with being alone better. Now that we have that clarified, no depression, no negativity, no negative phase. Everything is good and fucking dandy. And so it's like, there we go. That's pretty much it to that email. Now that we have that, kind of housekeeping bit covered, let's briefly get into today's episode, and let's try to be brief about it because yesterday's episode kind of spiraled out of proportion. And so, in today's episode, if you want to be strong, learn to be alone. And this can have a multitude of meanings, all of which we're going to go through. Number 1 is being physically alone, despite the fact that you may not have that much experience, but you just don't really like to socialize. However, you do socialize because you're uncomfortable being alone. And so you're in an uncomfortable situation, socializing in an uncomfortable, socializing because it is uncomfortable to you. Now we got it, finally. And if you don't socialize, you're uncomfortable too. So it's this pretty much catch-22 kind of lose situation where you can't be without people and you can't be with people because a lot of times it's like you're with the wrong people, you're with the wrong crowd. And that kind of, because you don't have access to other crowds, and that kind of leads to that. And it's like learning to be alone is in that context very valuable. And here's how to do that. What I did, I kind of distanced myself from a lot of my friends when I started pretty much my third career. It was like, it wasn't like there was no room for them. And I'm quite so certain that these were bonds that were made in childhood. And I think they're there to stay. So I could, easily get in touch with them and, we could have these dwellings in the past about how much better the world was 20 years ago, or, probably like 30 years ago when we were playing in the sandbox. I don't know, maybe, something like that, decades ago. And then comes a time in this discussion when you're catching up with the past, what did you go through the past, whatever, 30 years that we haven't seen each other. And then there comes this break, right? There's this break where things just, you get more towards the present moment, and your lives have taken such different tracks that you don't have any similarities currently. The similarities in the sandbox were like, you live in the same, sorry, banged the microphone because I was booming my hands. So I was like, you were in the sandbox together because you went to the same school, or you were in the sandbox together because you lived on the same street, or, there's a reason in that period of your life that you find people and that you are, kind of like more or less on top of each other, right? But then, it's like you develop differently despite the fact that you're in the same sandbox. And it's like the social influence comes in, it's like, job of your parents change, or, if it's later in life, you choose a different career path than your then best friend and whatever not. What I'm getting at is that, what am I getting at? It's like, with these, let's go back to catching up, right? The past 30 years. And then comes this point in the present moment where you get to this, you discuss current events, and you notice that the person you're talking to is totally different from the person you spoke to in the sandbox, right? They have a totally different mindset. They have a totally different opinion. And while in a less polarized world, like pre-Trump, and pre all of this polarization coming up in the past 1.5, 2 decades, it was easier, because you still got along. You were like, yeah, okay, you have a different opinion than I do. It's okay, right? And today there's so many friendships that break because, it's like you can't get along anymore, and you can't deal with that person because he's got a different opinion, or they have a different opinion. And I think that's wrong. So going back, to my childhood sandbox buddies and friends, whatever, I'm quite certain that I could call them up today when I'm in trouble, and they will be like, okay, this is sketchy, but I'll help you out. And I think that's kind of like what makes and breaks a friendship. Despite the fact that you haven't heard from each other for a few decades and someone's in trouble, there's still that bond from the past that kind of unites you, right? And that's what I tried to get at. Now, getting back to learning to be alone, in that context, for me, it was like getting new hobbies, and pursuing hobbies that really interested me, not pursuing joint hobbies because my friends wanted to, I don't know, get laid in a discotheque somewhere, right? For me, it was like, okay, I'd rather use the computer. Thank you very much. And the same applies for, obviously, being in touch with like-minded people. Now, if you're like me and you grew up in, well, I grew up pretty much in buttfuck Germany, only to be taken out of that and to grow up in buttfuck Alabama. Same difference. It's like, God damn it, what am I doing here? And there are not necessarily the right kind of people around you to then, have inspiring conversations with, right? You are around them because you have to, right? Like school. But that's it. It's like you don't have any shared interests, really. You don't share the same worldview. You don't have the same amount of enlightenment. It's like myself living in the US, there were a lot of military brats at the school, obviously. I was one myself. But living in the US kind of made it not the same exchange because wherever the American soldiers were stationed, they would have these, kind of ghettoized communities where they would just be amongst each other. So you don't really have exposure to a different culture, unlike me, who was taken out of buttfuck Germany to be put into buttfuck Alabama or buttfuck USA. And yeah, it was like a culture shock, right? And that's something that these kids never really got used to. So they were, kind of like believing that they understood, German culture because they'd eaten a bratwurst at Würzburg Hauptbahnhof, that kind of deal. But they didn't speak a word of German because they never left the base they were stationed on, only for small field trips. And, you don't have a lot of exposure to the culture, right? And so, in that context, it's like you don't necessarily have access to the people you want to exchange with. Now, luckily, the internet came along, which made it easier to connect with like-minded people from across the world and to share ideas and to inspire each other. And that's a very important thing. If you're in a situation where you are in a, pretty much like a lose-lose situation, you're uncomfortable with people and you're uncomfortable without them, it's like reach out to the right people, meet up with them. So there's internet communities for pretty much everything out there, right? And, create meetups and munches and whatever not, if this Rona thing ever blows over, then, it's like meet up with these people, right? And then you will see that you will get into a more comfortable situation in both parts, right? You'll be around people that you're comfortable with because you're, among like-minded people. And if you're at home alone, it's easier for you as well because you know that these people that you are around are in the background. So now that we've got that covered, took only 10 minutes to get there. To get to the fucking point. The next point in being alone is and becoming, being empowered by that is you are creating independence for yourself, right? And independence is, number one, a very empowering feeling, simply because you are capable of doing challenging tasks yourself, right? Let me give you an example. The other day I built, together with a friend, I built a carport, right? And before the winter came, we weren't able to put a roof on top of it. The guy fell sick. And so I essentially ended up having to do it myself. And I'm not really that good of a, handyman person. I'm learning. But I managed, and I got the neighboring farmer to take his tractor and put the tiling on the roof, which was like sheet metal. And I managed to do it all by myself, which was insanely cool. This awesome feeling. Number one, I had gotten them for free from the farmer. That was cool. And number two, it was just this situation you're confronted with, right? Of moving these sheet metal things, which were, I don't know, like 4 meters by 1, I think. So they were insanely huge, and it was windy. And so, it's like the umbrella effect, right? You have the wind that kind of makes it very difficult to put them where you want them. So anyhow, the end of the situation was that I managed to build this roof on my own, despite the fact that I'd never done it before. I hadn't watched a YouTube video. It was just pure logic and the drive to get it done. But this applies also for other situations, right? So with a roof, I have to add one additional point. Normally you have at least 2 people who are required to put these sheet metal things in its place, screw them down, blah. And I did it on my own because I figured out how to easily move them and so on and so forth. It went very quick, so not very frustrating. But this fact of independence, is like transpires to much less prominent situations in life. And, one of the things is for the better part of over a decade, once I started working, I was usually traveling. So for me, doing the laundry was putting my dirty clothes into a sack, hanging it in front of the door of the hotel room next morning, like magic. My suits were pressed, my shirts were cleaned and pressed, and everything was in a great situation. So for the better part of 20 years, I didn't ever use a fucking washing machine. There was no need to, right? And then comes a situation where you're like, okay, you move in together and you're like, okay, is there somebody going to come and pick up my laundry in front of the door, right? You're so used to it. So it's like, my better half actually had to explain a fucking washing machine to me. And that situation was just so bizarre that I was like, okay, I would have been seriously dependent on other people had I not learned this negligible skill set. And this was just pars pro toto, but there's just so many situations in life where you learn, right, just by applying common sense. And the result is just so fucking rewarding that it makes up for the deficit situation that you're basically in. And it's cool. It's like, I mentioned the other day this example with using a chainsaw. I was in the fire department for north of 20 years, I believe. And we had to do a certification course on how to use a chainsaw. And I was there for the theoretical part. But I was a battalion chief. So when it came to going in the woods and cutting down a tree, it was like I was chatting with another guy, and I didn't pay attention. So, here comes my new life, and you have to chop wood because you want it warm in the house. And I go into the woods with a chainsaw. I'm like, yeah, okay, this is where you turn it on, and yada, yada, yada. And so, I don't know, 2 hours into working, the chain would always just kind of flip off the sword. And I was like, why? What the fuck? And anyhow, took it to the shop. The guy's like, well, the oil is dry. I was like, no, the oil is not dry. There's gasoline with oil in there. And the guy's like, no, it needs oil on the chain it needs lubrication to actually run the chain. Otherwise it'll fly off. I was like, oh, okay. So even like your standing in an organization can kind of set you back because you are not familiar with the equipment that your people are using, right? So that's important, I think, in true leadership. Is just to really get down to it and also use the equipment and have your people show you how it's used, right? That was a lesson learned for me. It'll never happen again. But all of these are contributing factors to stuff that, create independence in you. And this independence feels fucking good. If you're confronted with a situation, you need to deal with it. And the person you would normally depend upon isn't there. What do? Right? Nothing. And so, it's quite valuable in learning skills like that and being able to rely upon them, to actually get the job or the situation that you're confronted with out of the way. And so that's another very big part of why learning to be alone can actually strengthen you. Now, there's a multitude of other factors I wanted to discuss, but perhaps we're going to do that in another episode because my random ramblings got us into or over the 20-minute mark. So we're going to shut this episode down for today. Tomorrow, because of this nasty feedback email, I hope you know who you are. We're not going to talk about solitude anymore. I don't know what we're going to talk about. I've got three actually episodes that are kind of like runners up. If you know somebody that has difficulties being alone, share this episode with them. And if you haven't subscribed, shame on you. And hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And then we'll be in touch tomorrow when we're going to talk about something totally new, which I haven't really decided upon. Have a successful day. And if you've already had your successful day, have a good night. Peace out, and we'll be in touch tomorrow.